I'm Dr. David Bernstein. Welcome back to our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now, last time we embarked on the last part of our series, which has to do with integrating positive psychology into schema therapy. And we talked about the importance of bringing mindful awareness to our modes. You know, how in those moments when we're triggered, when our modes are triggered, rather than reacting from our modes and then perpetuating dysfunctional patterns, we can bring mindful attention to our modes and make healthier choices. And today we're going to continue on with this theme of positive psychology, and we're going to talk about how we can help our patients to find and use their strengths. And that brings us to the topic for today: find it. Now, it's an interesting finding from positive psychology that people are often unaware of their strengths. And if they are aware of them, that they often don't use them. And, this is something that I've observed, and I don't know if you have too, that it's particularly at those moments when we need our strengths the most that we often don't use them. Moments when we're struggling or when we're, in a crisis, that it's often in those moments that we fall back on our negative self-defeating patterns, for example, self-soothing behaviors like addictions. And what we really want to help our patients to do is not only to learn how to recognize those patterns and those modes when they're triggered and bring some mindful attention to it, but we also want people to begin to use their strengths in those moments when they really need them. So, how do we do that? Well, in order to find people's strengths, we need to help them to embark on a kind of process of finding and using their strengths. And here is an image that we can use to kind of inspire our patients. And this is from the sword Excalibur from the tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Now, the legend goes that there was a contest to pull the sword Excalibur out of a rock. Right, the sword was stuck in a rock, and whoever could pull Excalibur out of the rock would become king. And the strongest men in the kingdom tried, and nobody was able to do it. And then here comes the young King Arthur. He's like a teenage boy, and he just pulls the sword right out of the rock and becomes king. Okay, now this sword is a metaphor, and the sword represents power, and it represents authority, the power and authority of the king. And what we would like our patients to be able to do is to start to recognize what their strengths are, and to start to pull those strengths out of the rock, to be able to start using those strengths as a source of power and authority in their own lives. Now, how do we help them to do this? Well, the first thing that would really help is if, our patients were familiar with different kinds of strengths, if we had a kind of vocabulary of strengths so that they could start to recognize them. And, this is very similar to, when working with modes, it's very helpful to educate patients about different kinds of modes, right? So that way, when they're familiar with them, they can recognize them at those moments when modes are triggered. Well, it's the same thing with strengths. We need to have a kind of, vocabulary of strengths. And so, what I've developed is a model, which I call the 16 Healthy Adult Strengths model. And it consists of 16 strengths that fall into 4 different areas. And this is a model that I created, by borrowing a lot of concepts from different sources, especially within positive psychology. And so I want to go over this model with you briefly, and as you can see, in each of these specific areas of strengths, each of these 4 areas, there are a number of specific strengths, and each one is represented with an image, and as you're going to see, just as with the I modes, that having images can help people to recognize their modes, these images of strengths can help people to not only recognize strengths, but inspire them to use their strengths. And so here are the 5 specific strengths that fall into the category of self-directedness. Here are, 5 specific strengths that help people to set their course in life, to be able to set goals and take steps in order to achieve their goals. And I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but just to choose a few of them, if you take a look at the middle one on the top, that's the strength of self-reflectiveness. In order to set our goals and to achieve our goals, we need to really stop and think. What's important to us? Which directions do we want to take in life? And then next to it, you see the image of the mountain climber. We have to have some self-confidence that we can actually achieve what we want to achieve. And on the lower left, we need to be able to assert ourselves, to be able to assert our wishes and our needs. Okay, so these are 5 specific strengths that contribute to our ability to set our direction in life, to set goals for ourselves, and to achieve them. Now, the next area of strengths are the strengths that contribute to self-regulation. How can we regulate our emotions, regulate our behaviors? What are the specific strengths that contribute to that? And here on the upper left, you see the strength of emotional balance, right? So, how do we keep ourselves, there's a strength that contributes to our ability, to, even when we get emotionally triggered, be able to stay in balance. And to the right of that, we see the image of the tree bending, and, that is the image for resilience. Though we want to be able to, bend but not break, in times of stress. Okay, so these are 5 specific strengths that contribute to our ability to regulate ourselves. And the next area of strengths are strengths that contribute to connection, to forming meaningful and mutual connections with other people. So here on the upper left, you can see the strength of empathy, right? So one of the strengths that helps us to connect with people is when we can feel what they feel, and when we can share that with them, that helps to strengthen our bonds with them and their, bonds with us. And to the right of that, you see, the 2 hands together, that is the strength of compassion. That when we want to alleviate the suffering of another person, and even take steps to alleviate that suffering, that is something that, again, that brings us closer to them and brings them closer to us. Okay, so these are 4 specific strengths that contribute to forming mutual and meaningful connections with other people. And the final category are 2 strengths that contribute to transcendence. And transcendence means, finding purpose and meaning in life. And for example, on the left here, you see the strength of thankfulness. That's something that, if we can be thankful for what we have in life, that can help us to, feel a sense of meaning and purpose. And on the right, the strength of wisdom. How can we draw important lessons from life, and to borrow from our culture, the teachings of, what are good values to exemplify in our lives. Okay, so these are the 4 broad categories, self-directedness, self-regulation, connection and transcendence, and the specific strengths that fall into them. Okay, so this is a kind of vocabulary of strengths that we can use with our patients. And if you're working with the strengths cards, it makes it, even more powerful, because now we have a kind of visual vocabulary that makes it easier for patients to understand and relate to what these specific strengths are. Okay, now, how does this work in practice? I'm going to start by just giving you an example for now, and then we're going to continue on in the next video. I want to take the example that we, introduced some time ago, and that is the case of Ron. And you may remember that Ron is a young man who came to treatment because he was getting into repeated arguments and verbal fights with his girlfriend. And it always had to do with the same repeating pattern, right? Ron wanted to go out with his friends frequently, and his girlfriend was hurt and disappointed. She didn't want him to go out, and then he would get very angry at her and then feel guilty and then submit to her demands. And this is a pattern that occurred again and again and again. And by the time Ron came to treatment, he felt very demoralized. He was even a little bit depressed. And he didn't feel very good about himself, especially about, blowing up at her and saying nasty things to her. He really felt he was a bad person. Okay, so, on the one hand, in schema therapy, we want somebody like Ron to be able to, recognize and understand his repeating patterns, right? To understand what those patterns are, and then in those moments when he's triggered, start to bring some mindful attention to his modes rather than taking his modes as reality and then reacting upon them in ways that reinforce them. Okay? So we want him to be able to grasp those patterns, bring mindful awareness to his modes, and make healthier choices. At the same time, we would like Ron to start to recognize and appreciate his strengths, because he has a lot of strengths. And in those moments when he's feeling so bad about himself, it's hard for him to know what those strengths are. But in listening to his story, it's possible to discern various strengths that he has, even when he's stuck in these self-defeating patterns. And then, in terms of giving Ron some feedback, we can take the Healthy Adult Strengths cards and one by one, lay them on the table and then show him what some of his strengths are. For example, one of Ron's strengths is the strength of humor. When he's with his friends, he's a fun-loving guy. He likes to laugh, he likes to play, and that makes him a great friend. And in fact, when he's with his girlfriend and they're not stuck in these repeating patterns and getting into fights, they actually have a lot of fun together. So one of his strengths is humor. Another one of his strengths is empathy. And where do you see that? Well, at those moments when he gets, mean with his girlfriend and he sees the hurt look on her face, he feels it. It comes inside. And this means that he has a strength. It's the strength of empathy. Now, he may not realize that. And at the same time, of course, the way he copes with that then is to feel very guilty, and that becomes quite self-defeating. But nevertheless, it does indicate that Ron has the quality of empathy. And furthermore, he wants to alleviate people's suffering. He has the quality of compassion. Now, how do we know that? Because when he sees the hurt look on his girlfriend's face, not only does he empathize with her, he wants to actually take steps to reduce her suffering. Now what does he do? He actually submits to her, her demands that he not go out. And that's unfortunately self-defeating. But the fact that he wants to go and alleviate her suffering is a positive quality of his. It's a strength. And last but not least, Ron has the quality of resilience. Okay, he had a tough childhood, and his relationship with his girlfriend has not been easy. And yet he's hanging in there, and rather than giving up, he comes to therapy and he wants to work on himself. And remember that, resilience is this quality of, bending without breaking. So, Ron doesn't break, he bends, and he, manages to go and find ways to move forward. Okay, so you can imagine now that in a situation like Ron, after you've spent some sessions identifying and working with those self-defeating patterns, it could be very, very helpful to start to turn to his strengths and to share with him the positive qualities that you see in him. Now, what kind of effect might this have on him? Well, it depends on the patient. We're going to get into that in a little while. But for many patients, they feel good when you start to give them feedback about what their strengths are. And furthermore, what we want to help patients to do is to not only recognize their strengths, but to be inspired to use them. And that was the whole point of creating images to go along with these strengths, because just when you see these, images, not only does it make the patient feel good, but it inspires them. They kind of have an image in their head of, oh yeah, this is one of my strengths, and I would like to be able to use this more often. Okay. Now, how do we go further here? Well, in the next video, we're going to talk about it. We're going to say, okay, how do we go further with this process of helping our patients to find and use their strengths? Metaphorically, how do we help the patient to take that sort of King Arthur and grab it and take it out of the rock so that they can start using it? And that will be the topic of our next video, Grab It. And please come and visit our iModes website www.imodes.com and take a look at our image-based therapy tools. Have a great week and see you next time.